The lawyer's office had that heavy smell of old paper and expensive furniture polish that makes you feel like you should whisper. Justin sat in the chair closest to the door, which felt like a mistake because it made him look like he was already halfway out the room. Across the desk, Julian and Beatrice had claimed the good seats, the ones that faced the lawyer directly, and made it clear they were the ones who truly belonged there. They were there to hear Max's will, or at least the parts of it that actually mattered to people like them. The house went to Julian, and the investments went to Beatrice, but apparently 2 inheritances weren't enough because Julian got the car too. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and finally said Justin's name, and the room went quiet. 47 acres, the lawyer read, his voice flat and uninterested. Remote mountain property. Market value is minimal, and the condition is listed as undeveloped. That was the moment they started laughing. And then they both turned to Justin with the kind of pity you give a person who just got handed the last piece of a burnt cake. Worthless, Julian said, and he used the word like he was being generous just by saying it out loud. Absolute garbage. But Justin noticed a detail that the lawyers and the vultures probably didn't care about at all. He saw Max's signature at the bottom of that page, and it was careful and deliberate, rather than the shaky handwriting of a dying man. This was the signature of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and it felt like a message left just for him. Why would Max leave Justin something that was supposed to be worthless? 3 months went by before Justin finally drove out to the property. He didn't go because he thought he could sell the land, but he needed to see it one last time, because that careful signature wouldn't leave his mind. The property turned out to be even worse than he had imagined. The access road turned into gravel and then dirt before it became a trail that was barely there, so he parked at the boundary marker and started walking. Trees had completely swallowed the path, and vines as thick as rope hung from the branches in a way that made the brush feel hostile and overgrown. Decades of neglect had turned the entire place into something wild and impenetrable, and Justin felt like he was trespassing on his own land. Then his hands scraped against something hard. He was about 200 yards into the woods, pushing through waist-high brush, when his palms hit cold metal instead of branches. He crouched down and started pulling away the vines while dirt came loose in heavy chunks under his fingernails. Beneath all that debris sat industrial metal that was rusted but still intact, and it looked like it was built right into the earth itself. It was an elevator platform. Justin's breathing stopped for a second, and he stayed there on the ground, just staring at the thing. An elevator out here in the middle of nowhere on a piece of property everyone called worthless didn't make any sense. Beside the platform sat a control panel covered in thick moss with buttons that were dark and dead. Above that panel, a manual crank system hung on iron brackets, and it looked ancient and mechanical as it waited for someone to finally turn it. Justin straightened up and looked into the deep darkness of the shaft. The elevator descended into a black hole where no bottom was visible, and it just kept going down and down. His quiet father, a man who spent his life as an accountant, had built something that seemed impossible. Justin reached out and touched the crank, and the metal felt freezing against his skin. He wrapped his hand around the handle and felt decades of rust catch against his palm, but the mechanism was still there and ready to move. It felt like the machine had been sitting in the dirt for years, just waiting for him to find it. He didn't pull the crank right then, but he just stood at the edge of the shaft and stared into the dark. He finally understood that he had never really known Max at all, and the real question wasn't why his father left him worthless land. The only question that mattered was what was waiting for him at the bottom. The crank was heavy, and that was the first thing Justin noticed when he finally grabbed hold of it. It wasn't rusted through, as the sheer weight of the iron suggested the metal remained solid underneath all that surface corrosion. He wrapped both hands around the cold bar and pulled downward with everything he had, but the mechanism didn't budge an inch. He pulled harder this time, feeling his shoulders tense up as he strained against the weight. He gave it another sharp tug, and finally, the crank shifted just a tiny bit. It was just enough of a movement to let him know that getting this thing to turn was actually possible. The third pull brought the sound. It was the scream of metal scraping against the shaft walls, the haunting noise of machinery waking up after decades of total silence. The crank groaned and finally caught, and Justin felt the resistance shift beneath his hands, as if he were pulling something alive out of the earth. His arms started to burn as he worked the handle hand over hand, the mechanism jerking in reluctant circles while the shaft seemed to swallow his effort without showing any results. But then, the elevator actually started moving. He felt the vibration before he heard it, the cage descending into the pitch black as the cable unwound from heavy spools somewhere above his head. The deeper that platform sank, the harder it became to turn the crank, and soon sweat was running down his temples while his forearms screamed in protest. The machine let out a groan with every single rotation, its metal teeth catching and releasing as the whole system fought against 30 years of sitting still. Then something changed. A light flickered deep in the shaft way below him. It started as a dull red before turning to amber, the brightness spreading upward like water filling a glass as the emergency systems finally kicked over. Machinery that had been waiting in the darkness was suddenly breathing again, and that red light transformed into a steady yellow that pushed back the black and let Justin see down the shaft for the very first time. The walls of the shaft looked different down there. Above him, the walls were just rough, natural stone, the kind of jagged rock you'd expect to find inside a mountain. But below the light, the texture changed into smooth, reinforced concrete that looked deliberate and engineered. Someone had taken this mountain and turned it into something with a purpose, building it and reinforcing it to make sure the structure was completely safe. Justin kept cranking even though his hands were raw and blisters were already forming where the iron rubbed his skin. He ignored the pain and kept pulling, watching as the elevator continued its slow descent 50 feet down, then 100. The walls became even more refined the deeper he went, proving this wasn't some accident of nature, but a piece of architecture someone had planned with real intention. The air changed. He noticed it the moment the elevator passed into the deeper levels, where the atmosphere felt cooler, denser, and clearly climate-controlled. Was the kind of environment that only exists when something matters enough to keep the power running. His muscles were on fire, but the crank actually became easier to turn as he got further down. The mechanical advantage shifted and the heavy load diminished, so the final 100 feet went by much faster as his hands pulled the iron in steady, burning rotations. The shaft walls finally opened up, and a massive chamber began to materialize in that flickering yellow light. And then the elevator bottomed out. The platform settled into place with a soft, metallic sigh, and the crank finally went slack in his tired hands. Justin let his arms drop to his sides, raw and shaking from the effort, while the yellow light from above illuminated the space in front of him. For a long moment, he just stood there, unable to process what he was looking at. It was a vast, underground chamber, an enormous room humming with the low, steady vibration of machinery sitting in standby mode. Equipment lined the walls, and workstations were covered in a thick layer of dust, but the metal tables held scientific instruments no accountant father should ever own. There were computers down here that looked older than he was, yet they were still maintained and connected, just waiting for power and a reason to wake up. 30 years of secrets were staring him in the face. Justin stepped off the platform and into a space that shouldn't have existed, surrounded by the evidence of a life he never knew his father had. This was the life Max had been living all along. Every single night and weekend he claimed to be working late or visiting old colleagues to handle their accounts. He hadn't been filing taxes, he'd been building this. The physical descent was over, but the real journey into his father's life was only just beginning. The workstations lined the walls like silent sentinels watching him move. There were computers from the 90s and the early 2000s, the kind of expensive equipment you'd expect to see in a university or a corporate research wing, not buried 100 feet under a mountain. Yet there they were, carefully positioned and maintained, covered in dust but organized with a level of care that bordered on obsession. Justin moved deeper into the room, his footsteps echoing against the floor. The dust was thick from decades of sitting still, but it parted cleanly wherever he stepped, which told him that no one had been down here in months or maybe even years. The machines hummed with a low energy, Systems that had learned how to wait and preserve themselves so they'd stay ready for hands that might never come back. Metal tables were covered in research equipment and strange devices he couldn't even name. He saw glass vessels, metal frames, and tools that clearly belonged in a high-end laboratory because they were so precise and purposeful. Everything was arranged with a clear plan, and every single item was labeled, which meant this wasn't just a place someone built and walked away from. This was a space someone had loved and visited regularly enough to keep the equipment functional and the dream alive. Filing cabinets stood against the far wall, made of heavy industrial metal that was built to last a lifetime. The labels on the drawers were faded, but he could still read the words: medical diagnostics, patent research, and protocol development. There were years of categories and decades of work documented and filed away, so Justin reached out and opened the nearest drawer. The folders inside were thick with papers, covered in handwritten notes, complex calculations and drawings with his father's handwriting on every single page. But it was the photographs that made him stop. They covered an entire wall, a mix of black and white photos and color slides that formed a timeline stretching across the years. He saw Max as a younger man, maybe 30 years old, standing in a white lab coat next to other researchers who all looked serious and full of life. Max was in the center of a group photo with his hand resting on a piece of equipment and a proud expression on his face. There were shots of him at a microscope, holding up a patent certificate and standing in front of a presentation board covered in data. This wasn't the man who came home at 6 o'clock every night to sit at the dinner table in total silence. This wasn't the boring accountant who spent his days managing other people's money and speaking in measured tones about quarterly earnings. This was a man who was accomplished and driven. Someone who burned with a sense of purpose and belonged in this underground world more than he ever belonged in the world above. The photos spanned 30 years, and Justin could see the whole story play out as his father grew older and the lab became more sophisticated. The early pictures showed Max working with a team, but as the years went on, the photos became much more solitary. He saw Max alone at his desk, Max examining test results, and Max standing in the middle of the chamber with his arms crossed, looking at something Justin couldn't see with a look that was both proud and deeply troubled. The very last photographs were taken recently. Max was in his 60s, looking much thinner, with the weight of those 30 years visible in the way he carried his shoulders. But he was still working and still reaching for something, and the final photo showed him standing at the main desk with his hand resting on a leather journal. He was looking directly into the lens as if he'd timed the shot himself, making sure he captured a specific moment for someone else to find later. Justin walked slowly toward that main desk. Every single thing he thought he knew about his father started to dissolve right then and there. The quiet, unremarkable accountant was nothing but a lie, a mask the man had worn for 30 years to hide the fact that he was someone else entirely. Underneath that performance was a brilliant and committed man who had sacrificed everything he had to protect a secret he believed in. The real truth was waiting right there on the desk. It was a leather-bound journal, the edges worn down from years of being handled, with Max's familiar script visible on the open pages. There were notebooks stacked beside it and a sealed envelope with Justin's name written on the front in careful, steady handwriting. Justin finally understood that his father had been living two separate lives the entire time, and he had left the truth down here in the dark, just waiting for his son to find it. Justin reached for the journal and opened it with a steady hand, though the old spine gave a sharp, dry creak as the binding finally gave way. That leather cover had done its job well over the decades, keeping the yellowed pages crisp and preventing the dark ink from fading into nothing. When he found the very first entry, he realized it was dated 31 years ago, back when his father was only 40 years old and still full of life. "I've started the work again," the entry began, and the words seemed to jump right off the page at him. "I'm away from the corporate eyes now, and more importantly, I'm away from their fear." Justin felt a sudden chill run down his spine, and his hands started to tremble as the weight of those words sank in. He pulled the heavy chair out and sat at the desk, losing himself in page after page of his father's tight, neat handwriting. It was the exact same penmanship he remembered from his childhood birthday cards, with those familiar loops and precise letters, but the man behind these words was a total stranger. Max hadn't just been a boring accountant, he was actually a researcher who specialized in medical diagnostics, and this journal was a play-by-play of a scientific revolution. He had mapped out ways to spot cancer years before a single symptom ever showed up, and he'd found markers for heart disease that appeared decades before a doctor would ever notice a problem. Metabolic shifts that usually took months of testing to pin down were being identified in mere weeks, which meant these diseases could be caught while they were still treatable and lives could be saved. His father had found a way to rescue millions of people from a slow death. The entries from 30 years ago felt loud and triumphant, filled with stories of colleagues and the thrill of having his methods validated by his peers. At the time, Max was presenting his findings to the pharmaceutical giant that funded his lab, and they were celebrating him, even building entire departments around the breakthroughs he'd handed them. But then, the tone of the writing took a dark, sudden turn. One entry simply said, "They've told me to stop the research because they claim it's disruptive to their market positioning, but I don't understand how saving millions of people can be a problem." The next entry was even colder, noting that the bosses had explained their stance more clearly, and they admitted that if early detection worked as well as Max proved it did, the market for expensive treatments would simply collapse. People don't need lifelong, high-priced interventions if you catch the sickness when it's still manageable. And that reality terrified the people in charge of the money. "They want me to walk away and let 10 years of my life die in a filing cabinet," Max wrote. "And they expect me to sign a non-disclosure agreement and pretend none of this ever happened." Justin looked up from the desk and stared into the shadows of the room, realizing his father had done the unthinkable by refusing to back down. This was a man who had spent 30 years building and maintaining a secret underground world because he couldn't stand to let brilliance be smothered by corporate greed. "So I built this place," the journal continued, "far away from their reach and funded entirely by my own pocket." Max admitted it would take every cent he had, but the work was simply too vital to toss aside, and he figured if he couldn't change the system from the inside, he would just build a new one where they couldn't find him. The pages detailed the grueling construction of the bunker, from buying the land under a fake company name to hiring workers who knew better than to ask questions. He bought equipment through surplus sales and back-channel deals, slowly turning a mountain into a hidden sanctuary for a future the world wasn't ready to face yet. What followed were 30 years of entries from a man forced to live two completely different lives. During the day, Max played the part of the boring accountant, a quiet man who came home to eat dinner and talk in dull tones about quarterly taxes and investment portfolios. He had spent decades making himself look small and unremarkable, almost like he was deflating his own personality so that no one would ever think to look twice at him. But when the sun went down, he became a genius working in the dark, refining his experiments and documenting discoveries that the rest of the world had tried to bury. As the years piled up, the writing started to feel heavy with paranoia. "They know I'm still out here," an entry from 15 years ago read, "and I can feel it in the way they ask casual questions or how strangers keep watching the edge of the property." Max started documenting the threats, which ranged from friendly warnings from old co-workers to legal letters claiming he was violating patents by doing his own research. They tried to buy the land at crazy prices and threatened him with lawsuits, all in an attempt to make him realize that refusing to quit would eventually cost him everything. Through all of it, Max never stopped. The very last entries were written only months ago, and while the handwriting was a bit shaky, the fire in the words hadn't dimmed at all. "The work is finally done," the last page said, "and everything I've learned is right here. But I've gone as far as I can go alone." He wrote that he needed someone who understood why the science mattered, someone who was brave enough to carry the weight of a secret this big. Justin looked at the sealed envelope with his name on it, realizing his father knew his time was up and that his son would eventually stand in this very spot. This wasn't just a house or a piece of land. It was a choice, a gift, and a heavy legacy that had been waiting in the dark for 30 years. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, Justin picked up the envelope and tore it open.
The paper inside was thick and cream-colored, the kind of expensive stationery Max only used for things that really mattered.
The handwriting was definitely his father's, but it looked different than the journal. It was looser and more emotional, as if the man had finally stopped being a scientist and started being a dad. Justin, if you're reading this, you've found the lab and seen the work, and I know you're probably wondering who I really was. Justin felt a lump form in his throat, but he forced himself to keep going. I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you the truth while I was still here, the letter read, because I wanted to tell you every single night, but I knew the second I let you in on the secret, you would become a target too. Max explained that he couldn't bring himself to put that kind of danger on his son's shoulders until Justin had the chance to make his own choice. The letter laid out the whole story, from the breakthroughs in imaging to the methods that could stop a disease before it ever became a tragedy. It was all there, and it was all real, but it was also the most dangerous information in the world. The company I worked for saw exactly what I had found, Max wrote, and they realized I hadn't just found a cure, but a way to make their entire business model obsolete. If people knew they were sick before the pain started, they wouldn't need the years of expensive drugs and hospital stays that kept the medical industry profitable. And that kind of transformation was a direct threat to the people in power. Max described the walls closing in on him, the hushed threats, and the terrifying promises that he would be taken care of if he just stayed quiet and let the research rot. So I built this place with my own savings and a few quiet loans, Max admitted, and I spent 30 years pretending to be that boring man who sat across from you at the dinner table. He told Justin that the accountant was a real part of him, but it was only a mask he wore to protect the part of him that actually mattered. Then came the part that changed everything, the reason Max had left the keys to this kingdom to his youngest son. I didn't build this place to be a burden for you, the letter said. I built it to give you a choice. Justin had to set the paper down for a second because his vision was blurring and his breath was coming in short, jagged gasps. You have two paths now, Max continued. And the first is to take this work to the press and force it into the light where everyone can see it. He warned that it would be a brutal fight against people who wanted the research buried, but he also pointed out that Justin could literally change the face of medicine and save millions of lives overnight. There was a long gap of white space on the page, a silence that felt like a heavy breath before the next sentence. Or you can just walk away, seal the door, and live a normal, simple life where you never have to tell a soul what you found down here. Max wrote that if Justin chose safety, the work would simply die with its creator, and that would be okay too. Justin felt the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. I won't judge you for whichever path you take, Max promised, because you didn't ask for this secret, and you didn't choose to carry this weight. He made it clear that the only reason Justin was holding this letter was because time had run out, and there was no pressure or guilt attached to the decision. The tone of the letter shifted then, becoming softer and more vulnerable than Justin had ever heard his father speak in real life. I don't regret the work or the sacrifices I had to make, Max confessed, because that was the only time in my life where I felt like I truly mattered and was fully myself. He apologized for the 30 years of pretending and for being a ghost in his own home, admitting he was sorry for the distance he'd kept even when he was sitting right next to his children. Then, he finally explained why Julian and Beatrice had been left out of the will. And it wasn't out of spite. Your brother and sister would have turned this into a paycheck or let the wrong people buy it just to keep their own lives comfortable, Max wrote. And they aren't bad people, but they just don't understand that some things are worth more than a bank account. He told Justin that he was the only one who ever asked the right questions, and because of that, he was the only one who deserved the truth. The final paragraph was short and hit like a physical blow. I'm sorry for the silence, but I'm not sorry for leaving you this legacy, and I'm sorry for the distance, but I'm not sorry for who I had to become to protect the world. Max ended by saying the work was now in Justin's hands, and whether it continued or ended was entirely up to him. The letter was signed simply, Dad. Justin clutched the paper to his chest and finally let the tears fall, standing alone in the heart of a mountain built on a father's secret love. The first week after Justin found the hidden lab, his brother Julian called. There was no hello and no polite questions about how he was holding up after the funeral, because Julian just cut straight to the point. His voice sounded tight and impatient as he told Justin they needed to talk about the property immediately. Justin was actually sitting at Max's old desk in the underground lab when the phone rang, surrounded by his father's handwritten journals. He almost let the call go to voicemail, but something told him to pick up and face whatever was coming. When he finally answered, Julian didn't waste a second on small talk. He told Justin he was being a fool for holding on to that land and claimed it was a legal liability that the family could help him get rid of. It was a strange shift in tone because just a week earlier, Julian had laughed in his face about the inheritance.
Back then, the family called the land absolute garbage and said it wasn't even worth a conversation, but now they were suddenly hungry for it. Julian was acting like he was doing Justin a favor by trying to take the deed off his hands, but the mask was slipping. Justin realized right then that something had changed on their end. Maybe they did some digging or heard a rumor about what Max was really doing out there, but the worthless land was suddenly the only thing they cared about. Justin didn't give them an inch, simply telling his brother he wasn't selling before hanging up the phone. The calls didn't stop there, and soon Beatrice was calling with a softer, more manipulative approach. She told Justin they were just worried about him and claimed he wasn't thinking clearly, but the concern felt fake and calculated. When the kindness didn't work, Julian moved on to threats, claiming they had documents to prove Max was unstable so they could challenge the will in court.
They didn't actually have any proof, but they hired lawyers and filed motions anyway to try and bully Justin into giving up. They demanded access to the property and tried to bury him in paperwork, expecting him to crack under the pressure. But Justin didn't play their game, and instead of hiring a big legal team to fight back, he just went quiet. He worked with a local attorney named Sarah, a woman who understood the emotional weight of the situation and knew the law inside out. She looked over the documents and confirmed that Max's will was airtight, meaning there was no way for the family to break it without exposing their own greed. Every decision Max made was documented and explained, leaving no room for Julian or Beatrice to find a weakness. The family eventually realized that a real legal battle would cost them more than they were willing to spend. To win, they would have to prove Max was incompetent while also admitting the land was valuable enough to fight over, which would have raised too many dangerous questions. They did the math and decided that the risk of drawing attention to the property wasn't worth the potential reward. The pressure lasted for a few months, but it eventually faded into a cold silence as the family moved on to other things. By the 6th month, Justin heard that Julian had bought a vacation home in Florida and Beatrice was shopping for a new luxury car. They stopped fighting the moment they realized they had no leverage left to use against him. Justin never told them a single word about the revolutionary lab hidden deep beneath the mountain. He let them go on believing he was just a stubborn, sentimental fool who was wasting his life guarding a pile of dirt. By letting them think he was a failure, he managed to protect the incredible secret his father had spent 30 years building.
Justin spent the next several weeks living in that lab, descending the elevator every morning to sit among the humming machines. He spent his days reading through Max's journals and studying technical drawings that were spread across the heavy desks. The pages were covered in his father's handwriting, filled with pencil sketches and complex math that mapped out a lifetime of secret breakthroughs. The science was incredibly dense, and Justin had to admit that his father operated on a level he couldn't quite reach. There were mathematical formulas in those notes that didn't exist in any textbook, and it took him a long time to piece the logic together. But as he moved from one entry to the next, the true scale of what Max had achieved finally started to click. This research was designed to find deadly diseases years before a doctor would ever notice a symptom.
It could spot microscopic cancer cells or identify heart disease through tiny metabolic markers long before a patient felt a single pang of pain.
Max had found a way to catch these conditions when they were still easy to treat, which meant he had found a way to prevent a massive amount of human suffering. The discovery had the potential to save millions of lives, but Justin also saw the danger hidden in the numbers. Modern medicine is a massive industry, and billions of dollars are made every year from treating advanced illnesses and performing late-stage surgeries. If Max's early detection method went public, the entire economic foundation of the medical world would probably collapse overnight. Justin finally understood why his father had been forced into the shadows for 3 decades. The moment Max tried to share this work with the world, powerful people would have moved to destroy him to protect their profits. He hadn't stayed in the dark because he was crazy. He stayed there because it was the only way to keep the science alive. The most important realization for Justin was that Max had left the lab to him for a specific reason. His father had faith that Justin could figure out how to bring this light into the world without letting it be extinguished. It wasn't just about revealing the truth, but about doing it in a way that made it impossible for anyone to bury it again. Instead of rushing to the media or posting the findings online, Justin decided to move with the same caution his father had practiced. He looked through the journals for names of scientists Max had actually trusted over the years. When he finally reached out to these researchers, they didn't need a long explanation to see that they were looking at a revolution. Justin quietly built a small network of doctors and ethicists who cared more about helping people than making a profit.
He found university partners who were willing to move slowly and carefully to ensure the research was protected from corporate interference. These were professionals who understood that one wrong move could give the wrong people the leverage they needed to shut everything down. Within a few months, the lab was fully operational again, but this time there were teams of people moving through the halls. The equipment that Max had built with his own hands was finally being used for its true purpose. The researchers worked with a sense of reverence, knowing exactly what it had cost one man to keep these secrets safe for so long. Justin took on the role of the protector, not because he was a genius scientist, but because he understood the value of the legacy. He realized that some things are more important than a comfortable life or staying safe from the vultures in his own family. Max had spent 30 years in the darkness to reach this moment, and now Justin was finally standing in the light his father had started. Justin walked away from his old job for the last time, and the lab began to hum with a brand new purpose. Real researchers started filling the halls because they finally understood the weight of what they were protecting, and scientific papers were soon appearing in every major journal. His greedy family never suspected a thing while the work grew, but the money was never the point of this fight. The real victory was seeing Max's work continue to save lives every single day, and that was the only legacy that mattered. Subscribe to see justice served in the next story. What would you do if you found a secret family legacy that changed everything?